X-Men is the most popular team in all of comics, but a huge part of that is because the team is made up of complex characters, and this means that their members don't always act heroically. It took me a while to think of this mutant that I'm about to talk about as one who was removed from the team, but when I did think of him, I wondered how that took me so long. We're talking about Gambit, who is known for being rough around the edges and somewhat untrustworthy, despite being a hero, because his origin is very much that he's a thief. Gambit ended up being kicked off the X-Men after he was put on trial and it was revealed that he'd been involved in the mutant massacre while working for Mr. Sinister. Obviously, not a great look. I'm pretty sure he was literally abandoned, they kicked him out hardcore. Not everyone is as they appear, and that is the case for this next mutant that I'm about to talk about, who was expelled from the team for not being what at first the team expected. We're talking about Magneto, who was revealed to be Zorn, and had the X-Men turn on him. Granted, this was all part of his plan, as he was attempting to basically infiltrate the X-Men and bide his time, but still, they weren't too pleased when they found out the truth, or at least what we all thought was the truth at that time. It would of course later be revealed that Zorn was not Magneto in disguise, but rather that Zorn was disguised as Magneto disguised as Zorn. Are you confused yet? Next up, we're talking about a mutant who also loves disguises, a mutant disguised as someone else to infiltrate the team. Sound familiar? I'll bet it does. And this revelation was not retconned, and actually led to a whole trial kind of coming out of it. However, while Fox clearly was no longer a student at the school after the revelation that, she was Mystique and she never really existed, Mystique would end up joining the team for a while. She would claim to want to join the team to spend more time with her foster daughter Rogue, but of course she'd later turn traitor to serve her own means, and then of course no longer on the team, because that's what happens when you become a traitor to the team. You don't get to be on it anymore. Although, I'm pretty sure Mystique was like, haha, this was my plan all along. I don't know what this is. I don't think Mystique has ever done this move, but in my world, apparently this is what Mystique does. Look, I think this next character ultimately belongs on the X-Men. You probably also think this next character belongs on the X-Men too, but at the end of the day, we all make mistakes, and sometimes that costs us our place on a team. In fact, I think that's what I love so much about this character, that she is flawed and does make mistakes, but it doesn't stop her from being a badass. We're talking about Emma Frost. Emma Frost was removed from the X-Men after she turned Cyclops into a martyr during Inhumans vs. X-Men. People would learn that Emma had basically instigated the war between the two sides, goading it into happening by using her powers to create an illusionary Cyclops, who she made it seem had perished as a result of a fight between Cyclops and Black Bolt, which of course never happened. Cyclops was not in fact killed in this way, but instead died accidentally as a result of being exposed to the Terrigen clouds, which it turned out were poisonous and basically fatal to mutants when exposed, which is the whole reason that Inhumans vs. X-Men happened. That, and of course Emma Frost just spouting miscommunication kind of everywhere and just making everybody turn against each other. When the truth of Emma's deceit was revealed, and she also unveiled Inhuman Sentinels that she planned to use in her fight against the Inhumans, the X-Men and the Inhumans both joined together and ended up turning on her. I don't know how you get to a place where you feel that Sentinels are a good idea, especially when Sentinels have been used against mutants for forever, but hey. Never mind. Emma obviously learned of her mistake, and she was only saved last minute by Havoc's interference, who teleported her away to safety as a kindness to the memory of his brother Scott. Even he was like, Emma, this is despicable, but I'm gonna save you for Scott. Okay, so to be honest with you, most X-Men members that I actually know of tend to quit the X-Men or simply take some time off, as opposed to being themselves forcefully removed. This video that I'm doing here, this one was a bit of a thinker for me. I really had to think it through. And this next member didn't technically quit, but also wasn't technically forcibly removed. Kinda a different thing that happened, but I'm gonna count it because I think it's still pretty terrible. He was forgotten. And that is honestly pretty messed up. We're talking about Vulcan, who was part of the X-Men rescue team assembled by Charles Xavier and more prominently Moira McTaggart before she was an evil villain and back when she was still an X-Men ally, who were sent in to rescue the original X-Men team from the sentient mutant island Krakoa, back when Krakoa was also not an X-Men ally. The team was not completely successful in their mission, but did manage to rescue Cyclops. However, most of the team, minus Darwin and Vulcan, perished during this attempt. And while Vulcan revealed he was Cyclops' lost little brother from space, Professor X decided it was best for all involved if Scott didn't keep those memories, which greatly upset him after the team was believed dead, because Cyclops was like, this was all my fault, when really, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was. Either way, Professor X shouldn't be messing with people's brains, but I digress. Vulcan and Darwin were believed dead, but didn't actually die. Instead, they survived, and when Polaris sent Krakoa up into space, They went with the island, floating in a stasis until the surge of energy from M-Day woke Vulcan up. And if you know the story of that, Vulcan was not very happy when he woke up. There was a time when Sabretooth was basically forced into joining the X-Men. I know it seems unlikely, but it did happen. Sabretooth had come to them for amnesty, fleeing the children of the Vault, who he'd come across. The X-Men then made Sabretooth take them back to the children, forcing him to join them in their fight. Probably not what Sabretooth had intended, but it was also a time when the X-Men were taking everyone in, so he was like, you know what, I'll just go to them, I'll be safe. And then they were like, no, let's go fight them together. After the X-Men won this fight, they decided they actually wanted Sabretooth to just stay on the team. But things got rough when Wolverine returned. As you can imagine, Wolverine had some feelings about this. It was their feud that ultimately put Sabretooth in the doghouse. Although I don't think people were really happy with either party, who were just fighting like crazy. However, it was also made to seem as though Sabretooth's involvement with Wolverine and the X-Men was part of Romulus's plan. Yeah, this is when Romulus was around, so things are weird. Wolverine inevitably convinced Cyclops and Emma Frost to let him take out Sabretooth permanently with the Muramasa blade, but the version that Wolverine killed was actually a clone. Either way, Sabretooth was not in the X-Men anymore. People were basically like, why did we ever have this guy on the team? Maybe not a great choice. It might shock you to hear about this mutant who was removed from the X-Men, considering many of us know him as the mutant who brought the team together, often holds the team together, and sometimes even leads this team. We're talking about Professor X. Yep, Professor X was kicked off the X-Men for lying to them. This was part of a downfall that had been brewing for quite some time. While Professor X ultimately always does what he thinks is best for mutant kind and for his team, the downfall of his character is that he often makes these calls on his own, and sometimes uses morally questionable or even sinister means to control or manipulate his team. Case in point, when it was revealed that the Danger Room was in fact a sentient AI mutant who we'd come to know as Danger. We would also learn that Professor X actually kind of knew about the room's evolution into a sentient being, and yet continued to oppress the room and use it to train his X-Men. Not a great look. Which meant that when Danger got free, she was ready to take out her frustrations on not just Xavier, but the entire X-Men too, who really hadn't known about any of this and were like, why would you do this, Professor X? This is awful. I'm not surprised that this next X-Men member we're going to talk about has had difficulties with the team, especially considering this isn't the main reality counterpart of this character. For this point, we're talking about Wolverine, but not just any Wolverine, we're talking about Ultimate Wolverine of 1610, because he's from a more gritty and edgy reality. It would make sense to me that Wolverine would have issues with his teammates. I mean, he often does even in the main continuity, but in the Ultimate reality, these feuds escalated with the Ultimate Wolverine even intending to kill Cyclops. He failed though, and instead was removed from the team just for his attempt. I don't think any of us are surprised by the inclusion of this next X-Men member, one who turned pretty evil and pretty much had to be removed from the team as a result. We're talking about Jean Grey's Phoenix, although really this wasn't Jean, as Jean was asleep in a stasis pod, and the Phoenix was kind of just using her image and her personality and infiltrated the team, then became corrupted, turned dark, and then because of Jean's personality ended up giving her own life up to protect both, mutant and mankind alike from her own destructive nature. I don't know, I'm pointing at myself. I'm not the Phoenix, but if I was, I probably would have a destructive nature because the Phoenix always turns dark usually. Still, even before that happened, the X-Men were having issues with Phoenix, so yeah, I would say even though Phoenix kind of removed herself from that board, ultimately the X-Men were not really pleased with her behavior. Cyclops was kicked off the team for doing the unthinkable, eliminating another member. He wasn't as much removed from the team as he was just like straight up arrested, to be honest. He doesn't even really resist either, not even claiming that he was, oh, I was under the influence of the Phoenix Force, which, he was at the time and would be a pretty fair defense. Instead, he sticks by his actions, having a final meeting with Captain America at the end of Avengers vs. X-Men. During this meeting, Cyclops would claim that, yeah, while he was possessed by the Phoenix, he didn't really fully remember everything super clearly, but he did remember the destruction that he wrought, the threat that he'd become, and taking Xavier's life. That's right, he took out Professor X. He seemed to think of these things as necessary sacrifices to pave a better way for the mutants, with more mutants appearing again after M-Day as a result of his actions, ultimately, because the Phoenix wasn't the destructive force that the Avengers thought it was, and the Avengers finally seeing that, they needed to help fight against mutant hate more. Overall, Overall, Cyclops considered this a win, even if he was locked up as a result. Cyclops would go on to escape prison, but that would only happen when Sinister found a way to infiltrate his cell, revealing their survival and basically convincing Scott that he was the only one who could stand against this mad scientist. So Cyclops broke out to defeat Sinister, thinking that was the only way.
Kicking off our list at number 10 is Anathnamoot, better known as the Sphinx. Now, when we say this guy's ancient, we mean ancient. We're talking older than your grandma's fruitcake, older than dirt, older than, well, you get the idea. He's been around for at least 3,000 years, which means he probably has strong opinions on what real papyrus feels like and thinks hieroglyphic is the superior form of writing, the kids and their cuneiform. Am I right? This guy's got more ties to ancient Egypt than a mummy's linen closet. I wouldn't be surprised if he helped build the pyramids. Probably got workers' comp for a bad back, too. Probably filed a complaint with the foreman. These stones are not ergonomically sound. You know he did, but don't let the age fool you. The Sphinx isn't just some dusty relic collecting cobwebs in a museum. Thanks to the mystical Ka stone, a cosmic artifact that's probably older than he is, this guy's packing some serious power. We're talking superhuman strength that could probably win him a gold medal in the tossing obelisks event at the Olympics, if they had that back then, which knowing him, he probably started. He can also manipulate energy, which means he can blast you with the force of 1,000 suns, or, you know, just heat up his coffee without a microwave. Convenience is key when you're immortal. He's basically a walking, talking, energy-blasting history lesson. You want to know about ancient Egyptian burial rituals? Ask the Sphinx. Need help translating hieroglyphics? Sphinx is your guy. Want to know if aliens really built the pyramids? He'll probably just wink and say maybe, because he's seen some stuff, man, stuff you wouldn't believe. Now, the Sphinx has had his share of run-ins with the superhero crowd, most notably the Fantastic Four and Nova. These aren't exactly small-timers, which means the Sphinx can clearly hold his own in a super-powered brawl. He's like the grumpy old man of the Marvel Universe, yelling at those darn kids to get off his lawn, except his lawn is a 3,000-year-old temple, and he yells with the force of a supernova. Sure, he hasn't been a regular thorn in the X-Men side, but let's be honest, with his kind of power and lifespan, he's like that weird uncle at the family reunion who might accidentally set the house on fire while trying to show off his magic tricks. You just don't know what he's capable of, and that's what makes him dangerous. He's a total wild card, a living, breathing what-if scenario waiting to happen. The X-Men might not be on his radar yet, but if he ever decided to take a break from reminiscing about the good old days of pharaohs and plagues, they'd have a serious problem on their hands. He's got the power, the experience, and the potential to be a major headache for anyone, even a team of highly trained mutants. He is not to be trifled with. Sliding into number 9 is Genesis, Apocalypse's ex-wife. Talk about a messy divorce. This lady's been around for 4,000 to 5,000 years, probably spent most of it arguing with Apocalypse over who gets custody of the celestial technology. She rules the ancient mutant island of Araco, which is like the Bermuda Triangle, but with more angst and plant manipulation. Genesis is an Omega-level mutant who can control plant life. She's basically Poison Ivy's great, you get the idea, grandmother, but with a much bigger grudge. If she ever decided to swap her island paradise for world domination, the X-Men would be facing a whole lot of angry trees. And trust me, you haven't lived until you've been smacked by a sentient redwood. Number 8 brings us the enigmatic Forever Man, who's less of a man and more of a, well, a series of men. This guy's like a human version of a save game file, constantly being reborn with all his old memories. He's been kicking around for at least 5,000 years, which means he's probably seen every fashion trend come and go, and come back again. Forever Man's not the strongest mutant, but he's got more knowledge and experience than Wikipedia and a library had a baby. He's like that one guy at the party who's seen it all, done it all, and has a story for everything. The X-Men would be wise not to underestimate him unless they want a lecture on the proper way to churn butter or the best places to avoid the plague. Coming in at number 7 is Exodus, a mutant crusader from the 12th century. This guy probably still thinks doth is a perfectly acceptable verb. Transformed by Apocalypse, Exodus became a true believer in mutant superiority, like Magneto, but with a serious case of Messiah complex. Exodus is packing some serious heat, telepathy, telekinesis, teleportation, the whole psychic enchilada, and his powers are juiced up by his unwavering faith, which is basically like giving a toddler a double espresso and a mega megaphone. He's a danger to anyone who doesn't subscribe to his Mutants Are the Best newsletter, and that definitely includes the X-Men. At number 6, we have Azazel, Nightcrawler's deadbeat dad. This guy's a real piece of work. He's an ancient extra-dimensional mutant with ties to biblical demons, which probably explains why he's not winning any Father of the Year awards. He probably skips out on child support too. Azazel can teleport, induce fear, and probably knows all the best places to get cheap drinks in the underworld. He's basically a chaotic, teleporting nightmare, and his presence is a guaranteed headache for the X-Men. Plus, family drama? No thanks. Number 5 brings us Saul, an external, which is basically the X-Men universe's version of the Highlander Club. Nobody knows exactly how old this guy is, but it's definitely in the older than dirt category. This guy probably remembers when Pangea was the hottest vacation spot. Saul's got a grab bag of powers, energy blasts, force fields, telepathy. He's like a Swiss Army knife of mutant abilities. He's also cunning and manipulative, which is a dangerous combination when you've lived for thousands of years and have probably seen every trick in the book. He's the kind of guy who would cheat at Monopoly and then claim he invented the game. He is now dead, killed by number 2 on our list. And at number 4, we have another external, Gideon. This guy's so old, he probably remembers when fire was the hot new invention. He's also a ruthless businessman, which means he's probably got offshore accounts in the time stream or something. Gideon can absorb and redirect energy, and he's got superhuman strength, durability, and speed. He's basically a walking, talking battery with a bad attitude. He's fought both with and against the X-Men, making him about as trustworthy as a used car salesman. He is also, you guessed it, dead. Taking the bronze medal at number 3 is Iska the Unbeaten. Her power? She can't lose. Seriously. It's like she has a cheat code for life. She's been around for about 10,000 years, probably winning every game of rock, paper, scissors along the way. Now, she's been an X-Men ally, but let's be real, that's probably just because they're the winning team right now. If the X-Men ever start losing, Iska would probably switch sides faster than you can say mutant registration. Facing her is basically like playing a game where the other person has already declared themselves the winner. Where's the fun in that? At number 2, we have Selene, the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club, and the reason why the term cougar was probably invented. This lady's been around for a whopping 17,000 years, and she's not afraid to use her, shall we say, experience to get what she wants. Selene's a psychic vampire who can drain your life force faster than you can say bad decision. She's also a powerful sorceress, which basically makes her the ultimate evil goth girl. In the Necrosha storyline, she resurrected millions of dead mutants because apparently she was bored and needed a hobby. She's ruthless, cunning, and probably has a killer skincare routine. You don't live for 17,000 years without picking up a few beauty secrets, and she did kill numbers 4 and 5 on this very list. And finally, the big cheese, the head honcho, the ancient mutant who takes the number 1 spot, Apocalypse. This guy's so old, he probably remembers when the Dead Sea was just the slightly unwell sea. He's been around for 5,000, 6,000 years, give or take, and he spent most of that time trying to make survival of the fittest the official motto of Earth. Apocalypse has more powers than a Swiss Army knife factory. He can shapeshift, teleport, shoot energy blasts, control minds. Basically anything you can think of, he can probably do it. And he's immortal, thanks to his fancy Lazarus chamber, which is like a cosmic reset button. The Age of Apocalypse storyline showed us what happens when this guy wins, and let's just say, it's not pretty. He's the ultimate threat to the X-Men, the final boss they might never be able to defeat.
The end of the Hellion series has to be one of the most brutal things I've ever read. It was actually like painful for me to read. My heart seriously hurt after finishing that series, and I was in tears for honestly most of the last issue. To watch this team of lovable but extremely weird misfits come together over multiple issues throughout this series, only to see many of them slip and self-destruct, was honestly something else. They had found a sense of family, only to lose that newfound family, and with it, for many of them, honestly their sense of hope. It was a brutal ending to what was otherwise honestly an uplifting story. I still can't believe that's how it ended, honestly. Zeb Wells out here just playing with my emotions, playing with my heart. I think the worst character for me in terms of how the story ended for them was honestly Wildchild, who basically decided to just accept that like he didn't really belong anywhere and submitted to being in a medicated stupor. It really was tragic. What stories have moved you emotionally? For me, Wild Child's and the Hellions ending overall just literally brought me to tears. I actually struggled to read the pages. That's how much I was crying at the end of this series. It was really heartbreaking and really brutal. This is a traumatic one, or at least it probably was a traumatic one for Wolverine at least. Yep, we're talking about that moment. The moment when Wolverine was permanently separated from his adamantium. What are we talking about here? Divorce, babe. Divorce. Wolverine was divorced basically here from his adamantium, something that initially in the comics was suggested to be part of his mutant power. However, over time, of course, we'd come to learn that the adamantium-coated skeleton that he had, his claws, was not necessarily inherent, but was instead put in place by Weapon X. He did have claws, but they were just bone claws, and then Weapon X basically modified him and coated his whole skeleton in adamantium. When the X-Men faced off against Magneto in space, Magneto used his magnetic mutant powers to manipulate this metallic substance, this adamantium, fully removing it from Wolverine's skeleton. He'd get it back, but the extremely gruesome and painful de-adamantium process would leave its mark, making Wolverine more animalistic soon afterwards. Professor X has a lot of brutal moments in the comics. Honestly, he is tied to many of them because he has done some morally questionable things throughout his comic book history. One of these moments, however, might seem small in comparison to some larger missteps that he's had, but it still shocks me to this day, and I find it honestly quite brutal in a different way, so I'm gonna include it here. We're talking about Professor X admitting his feelings for Jean Grey. This wasn't something that Professor X shared aloud, but just seeing it confessed to, even in a thought bubble, was honestly enough for me. Now granted, at the time, I doubt this would have been as shocking when this comic was released, because it was like issue number 3 of X-Men, considering that canon had not yet established that Jean was actually one of the Professor's really first X-Men, who he'd helped when she was only a little kid and he was a young adult. But given the context I had when I read this, yeah, it's a mess. One of the most brutal fights I've seen in a while is the one where Storm faces off against Tarn. Tarn the Uncaring is one of the mutants from Morocco, and he happens to be one of the most upsetting to face. Honestly, because of his mutant powers. Also, he's a mutant of Morocco, so you know, they tend to be made of just tougher stuff in general. But really what makes his fights in general brutal are, honestly, his powers. Tarn can basically alter folks' genetic makeup, which is exactly what he does to take Storm's powers away after challenging her to a fight. Or rather, after insulting her authority as Regent of Morocco, which she interprets basically as a challenge. And honestly, rightfully so. She responds in kind by saying she will see him in the circle for the two of them to duke it out between them for who should sit as regent. Or rather, maybe just like who should respect who. Now, when they do, Tarn uses his powers to take away Storm's powers and disfigure her. But still, she manages to best him by stabbing him in the chest and threatening to end his life by puncturing his heart. Yeah, Storm, even when she doesn't have powers, she's a really amazing fighter, so you should not mess with her. She forces him to yield, and in the end, he learns just how strong-willed Storm is and ultimately returns her powers to her, admitting she is of Morocco, and perhaps she might even be of a Ment. That's how intense she is. I was not expecting this next one, which is quite a twist. Or rather, I wouldn't have been expecting it if I hadn't read it later. 2023 for me was a year of mainly focusing on indie comics in terms of my collection, seeing if I could make it like a whole year without really collecting mainly superhero comics from the big two myself, instead focusing on collecting books from smaller or still large but honestly alternative publishers. Dynamite, Image, IDW, and even still some like really indie like self-published stuff. For the most part, I succeeded in last year's New Year's resolution. Yay, in regards to this, but the downside was I ended up being more behind on my big two superhero stuff, like X-Men. As such, I already kind of knew the events of the Hellfire Gala before I actually read that Hellfire Gala. Even knowing it though, it was still shocking to behold Nimrod flying in and pretty much insta-killing, for the most part, the newly announced X-Men team. Honestly, poor Dazzler. I was so excited about Dazzler joining that team, and then when I heard that that happened, I was like, ugh. And then when I read it, I was like, ah! Contrary to the last point, this one was very unexpected. Obviously with Hellfire Gala, I kind of already knew what happened even though I hadn't read it yet. This one caught me unawares. It's because it was one of the first fights that we saw during the Ten of Swords Otherworld tournament, and I honestly had expectations going into this event that were instantly shattered here. Pardon my pun there. Sorry, Betsy. In this first fight of the tournament, Captain Britain's Betsy Braddock was forced to face off against Morocco's champion, Iska the Unbeaten. Iska gets her name from her mutant powers, which prevent her from ever losing. And while I expected that Betsy might be the first one to, pull off such a feat and make Iska lose, since she was the hero in this scenario and Iska at the time was the villain, it turns out I was wrong. And true to her name, Iska made short work of Betsy, literally shattering her into thousands of pieces. Yeah, I didn't see that one coming. I feel like wait, what just happened pretty much sums up Ten of Swords as an event. It's just bonkers. Bonkers I think in a good way, but that's my opinion. Another battle that I wasn't expecting to go how it did was the one with Uranos versus, well, pretty much all of Morocco to be honest. But more specifically for this point, I'm talking about the Eternals villain facing off against Magneto, who is of course usually a villain of the X-Men, but in X-Men Red is really more of a hero here. Magneto here seemingly holds his own at first, but in the end has his heart removed by Uranos and is left for dead. It's also a pretty quick fight, it's like brutally quick. It's a seemingly gruesome end for a long-standing character, but what's even more intense is it would shortly after, in the same issue, be revealed that Magneto was so committed to getting revenge here, so willful, that he refused to die, using his powers in place of his heart to move his blood through his body and will himself to keep going so he could live to get revenge on Uranos for what he had done to mutant kind and planet Morocco. Heartless Magneto is scary Magneto. This death of a character I'm about to touch upon though is an honest real one. Synch was long dead up until recently in the comics. Thankfully, he was one of the first that the mutant nation of Krakoa brought back, prioritizing his resurrection so that he might be acclimatized and prepared for his mission in the vault alongside Darwin and Laura Kinney's Wolverine. Before his mission there, however, which he miraculously survived, he gave his life to protect others when Emma Frost's school for young mutants was attacked. This was his previous death. Tragic. Generation X, let's go. What makes his death in Generation X even more brutal is the fact that Synch gave his life to basically save other human kids who also attended the school, even though many of the human kids there were pretty unkind to the mutant student body they were forced to share the school with. Another heartbreaking defeat that I found to be extremely shocking and brutal was the loss of Captain Kate Pryde. And Lockheed, poor Lockheed, though fortunately Lockheed, his life was not lost. We must protect Lockheed at all costs. This all went down in the first volume of Marauders, a series that constantly pushed the envelope I felt for what we expect of these characters while also staying true to them. Kate was the leader of this new Marauders team, making her pretty much the main character of the series, so seeing her lost at sea at the hands of Sebastian Shaw was devastating, especially when you consider this happened only in issue 6 of this series. Yeah, just taking everything we thought we knew about what was going on and flipping the script. While a lot of the times we talk about the events of House of M and M-Day as being like the worst things mutants have ever lived through, there was a moment that was even more a brutal loss for Marvel Mutants in comparison, I'd wager. One that also cost millions of lives. Millions of lives. I think actually M-Day only cost million, and not even lives, just depowering individuals, but in this case, these people were wiped off the face of the earth. Cassandra Nova returned to get her revenge and ended up killing Donald Trask III in one of the most disturbing ways I've ever seen in a comic, while also merging with him, able to use his voice after his death to command the Master Mold and Sentinels. During the E is for Extinction story, Nova unleashed these Sentinels on Genosha, resulting in what we refer to today as the Genoshan Massacre, which cost mutant kind an estimated 16 million lives. Yeah. Doing far more damage than M-Day and making M-Day even more devastating as a result when it did happen, since the mutants' numbers were already severely reduced going into the House of M event because of course, the Genoshan Massacre. Like if the Genoshan Massacre hadn't have happened, we would have had more mutants even after M-Day because there'd just be more people in general. So even though many of them would have been depowered, we still would have had a lot left.
Coming in at number 10, we have Rays. I love when we start getting alternate universe stuff because that's when things really get crazy. You can mix and match and get all sorts of super combinations that you want. And in this case, we have Wolverine and Mystique getting busy and making a baby that has both their powers. Rays is the combination of two heroes to make one of the best spies of all time. Because the thing about Mystique is you can break into almost anywhere because of your ability to shapeshift, but you're at high risk of getting killed because you don't have any sort of protection outside of your hand-to-hand combat and skills with weapons. But then you mix in Wolverine's healing factor and some razor sharp claws, and you have a soldier who can sneak into any place and take out the competition like no one else on the squad. While Raze might not be the most powerful mutant of all time, you can't deny the utility and subtlety that someone like Raze could bring to the table. I don't know if Raze is a fitting enough name for someone who can sneak around and kill someone with claws. They should be called Badger, or Sneaky Badger, or Mongoose.
Number 9. Chimera. Chimera is the daughter of Storm from the alternate Earth of 13729. The same reality that Raze hails from, actually, weirdly enough. The identity of Chimera's father has never been confirmed, but many believe that she's the daughter of Storm's frequent love interest, Black Panther, which would be pretty cool, and I think is what we all want to happen here. We don't normally get to see what these two's future children would look or be like, so yeah. Chimera is a mutant like her mother and first appeared in Wolverine in the X-Men issue 36. She was created by Jason Aaron and Ed McGuinness, and she possesses telepathic powers which allow her to communicate with and influence animals. She's also an expert tracker, which implies to me that she's either the daughter of Black Panther or possibly also of Wolverine. A reality where Wolverine is kids with both Mystique and Storm, though, seems really intense, so I'll just leave that in your mind.
And before we get into our next point, just give this video a big thumbs up because that really helps us out, guys. Coming in at number 8, we have Megan Frost. I don't know what it is with Scott Summers, but it seems that he has a thing for telepaths, or they have a thing for him. I'm not sure which way the pendulum swings, but either way, he has a few kids via telepaths. This time, it would be him and Emma Frost who would hook up and make Megan Frost. Megan comes to the table with a host of powers from her parents. She's got her dad's psionic blast, and she's got her mama's telepathy. She also has a host of telekinetic powers, so it would seem that Scott Summers might have some hidden telekinetic powers in his genes because his other kids do as well. Now on the downside, Megan didn't get her mom's diamond skin, which is one of her most legendary powers, but she makes up for this by training hard in hand-to-hand combat to the level where she could knock out anyone who might be able to sneak by her telepathy and get within punching range.
Number 7. Rogue. Rogue is the daughter of Mystique and Destiny. Well, adopted daughter anyways, but they were both definitely more influential in the raising of Rogue than our own biological parents, so I consider them more of her parents than our actual parents, I guess? They are her actual parents. That's it. Before she ran away as a teenager, Rogue was raised in a hippie commune by her father and aunt after her mother disappeared. After she'd left, she ended up being approached by Mystique, who was told to seek her out by her long-term partner, Destiny. Rogue joined the two of them and they raised her like their own daughter. While Rogue is super awesome and powerful, Mystique is rarely associated with the X-Men, which is why Rogue ranks so low on this list. Basically, she's paying for her mother's generally more villainous tendencies, which has also factored into her story in the comics many times before. Poor Rogue, and also honestly, poor Mystique.
Coming in at number 6, we have X-23, the most famous child of Wolverine, and certainly one of the most deadly. X-23, also known as Laura Kinney, is the clone of Wolverine, but also kind of his daughter. It's a little bit of a weird backstory. She's a clone, but she wasn't grown in a tube like most clones are, or I think they are. I don't know a lot about science. But she was actually grown in someone's womb, so that pretty much makes her a baby like any other baby, but she was for sure a clone. Are you confused? It's comic books, that's just how things are sometimes. But she's got all of her daddy's powers, and she can cut you down faster than a Vitamix blender. She can show that she can be a prolific Wolverine replacement, since after Logan dies, she steps into the role as the new Wolverine and starts taking dudes out just like her old pa. And something very interesting about this character is that the first time she showed up, it wasn't actually in comics, but it was in the TV show called X-Men Evolution, which was about a bunch of teenage versions of the X-Men all going to school together and having school problems, you know, and school stuff.
Number 5. Shogo. Shogo Lee is the son of Jubilee, and while he might just be a baby currently, he's still been a powerhouse recently in the comics. Shogo was adopted by Jubilee after he was orphaned by a meteor strike. Sounds random, but it actually tied into stuff. Anyways, for Jubilee, adopting Shogo was very important and a big part of her growing up as a character. As far as we know, Shogo is not immune like his mom, but he did have some pretty cool powers while in Otherworld. His imagination combined with fairy magic granted him the ability to turn into a dragon while in Otherworld. A mother freaking dragon. A dragon. So yeah, he is basically a dragon whenever he's there in Otherworld, which makes him pretty powerful while on those planes. Saturnine herself also took a shining to him, and he was instrumental during the fight at the end of the Ten of Swords event.
Coming in number 4, we have Cable. I mean, how do we make a list of children of X-Men and even think about leaving out Cable? Cable is the son of Scott Summers, better known as Cyclops, and the very powerful telepath Madeline Pryor, who's the evil clone of Jean Grey. See, Scott thought he was gonna have a baby with Jean, but it was a trick! There's so many tricky babies in comic books. Well, they had a baby, and that baby became insanely powerful, one of the most powerful telepaths, and then he becomes a skilled soldier, and then he goes back in time to work with his dad and sometimes against his dad. It's a very complicated situation. He also gets some sort of technovirus put into him, and it makes it harder for him to use his powers because he has to constantly use his mind to fight off the technovirus. And he gets cloned, and his clone is evil and has no virus. And he's buddies with Deadpool. The two of them work together in a straight man stooge double act kind of thing.
Number 3, Polaris. While some might think of Magneto as more of a villain and therefore not one of the X-Men, he has been a member on and off throughout his history and has even led teams both within and without the main continuity. His daughter Lorna Dane and himself have one of the most strained relationships of all of the X-Men and their kids. This has been highlighted recently and ultimately comes down to the fact that initially Magneto manipulated Lorna, keeping the truth of him being her father from her. Not a great start. Even when that fact was revealed to her, he still hadn't been the best dad, and Polaris has even called him out on this before in the comics, reminding him that he doesn't even really know her. Yeesh. Still, the two teaming up together are able to perform some pretty powerful feats as both share the power of magnetism.
Coming in number 2, we have Legion. If you're Professor X's kid, you know you're going to be extremely powerful, and you would think you would be raised by the perfect dad and have one of the best fathers around. Well, even though Xavier is good at raising kids that he has no blood connection to, he isn't that good at making a strong connection with his own son. Part of it is just bad parenting, and the other part is Legion is a lot to deal with even for the most powerful, responsible, and well-adjusted parents on the planet. See, Legion isn't just one mutant. He has split personalities that live in his body, and each one of them has their own mutation. So Legion can switch from personality to personality and change his power. That's a pretty serious combination of abilities that probably work really well together. Well, here's the thing. You don't need his powers to work together because several of these mutants are Omega level. And when I say several, I mean around 200. And even the ones that aren't strong enough to wipe out existence itself, which Legion has done more than once, they are still strong enough to create an amazing storm of chaos. And there are new powers and personalities being created all the time inside Legion's body. Rogue was inside Legion's mind once, and she said there were over 1,000 personalities with new ones being born.
Number 1, Daken. Daken is definitely one of the most iconic X-Men kids, I believe. Although, obviously, X-23 is also up there. I'm sorry that I just dissed her by putting Daken above her. And he's a really well-known X-Men kid, despite the fact that he has major daddy issues. Daken is now all grown up and is currently part of the X-Factor team, but he has been all over the place when it comes to his alignment since he was first introduced in the comics in Wolverine Origins issue number 10. We've seen him as both a villain working against his father, even trying to kill him. We've seen him take on the Punisher alongside the Dark Avengers, acting as Osborn's assassin. We've seen him tangle even with the likes of Deadpool and be manipulated by the lovable and very unstable Mirth, but he's also acted heroically from time to time, and now seems to be more on the side of those things with X-Factor. Though, then again, Krakoa is a place for all mutants, so it's not like him being a bad boy would ever mean that he'd get kicked off the team. And when it comes to mutant bad boys, Daken is definitely one of the baddest. I need to do a mutant bad boy list so I can put him at the top.
We're starting off our list light with a bit of a silly little retcon that seemed to be entirely pointless. Chris Claremont's run on the New Mutants is praised for its awesome character work and the cool locations the team goes to. For example, we got the introduction of the character Magma, who came from the long-forgotten Roman colony known as Nova Roma. Nova Roma was super cool because it was a society that had changed very little since the days of the Roman Empire. However, after Chris left, X-Men villain Selene changed that. Also hailing from Nova Roma, Selene revealed that she had in reality brainwashed everyone into thinking that Nova Roma was real, while the whole thing was just a big, dumb, elaborate hoax. However, like a boss, when Chris Claremont later returned to the X-Books, he changed things again so that the hoax was part of another bigger hoax instead, and he made it so Nova Roma was back to what he originally had created. Now, I kind of like this next retcon, but there is no denying it does Professor X pretty dirty. Yeah, we are talking about Deadly Genesis. Professor X assembled the all-new, all-different X-Men after the Krakoan attack on the original X-Men. Cyclops was the key survivor of that attack, and he escaped, found Xavier, and requested additional aid. From there, Xavier recruited Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, etc. as his all-new X-Men. However, there was another. Professor X had actually made up an entirely different team which included Cyclops' long-lost brother, Vulcan, and he sent them on the rescue mission way underprepared with no real experience before he sent his new X-Men team. That entire team was decimated. That's bad enough for Xavier, but then you take into account that Professor X then mind-wiped Cyclops of the events and covered it all up. It made the character of Professor Xavier far less heroic than traditionally perceived. It also brought about an entirely new cast of characters and gave Cyclops even more reason to become just a smidge bit more unhinged. But morally dubious Professor Xavier kinda works really well. I like it. The Decimation. It's a huge event in the X-Men canon. This is when the Scarlet Witch wished away the X gene completely when she said no more mutants, and the next decade of X-Men comics centered on that decision. With just 198 mutants left and no more mutants being born anymore, mutants were on the edge of extinction. Obviously, the mutants absolutely hated Wanda for this, and for good reason, but alas, all was not as it seemed. The Scarlet Witch's involvement was soon altered in Avengers: The Children's Crusade, as the X-Men discovered that Victor Von Doom was secretly behind the decimation. Sure, the X-Men still hated the Scarlet Witch for a long time after, again, rightfully so, but the comics removed some of her blame for the situation. It was a serious change given how important the decimation was for the X-Men. The Dark Phoenix saga was landmark. That story set the precedent that even longtime X-Men, some of the most loved characters, weren't beyond being corrupted and turned into the bad guy. Not only that, but they could also cause problems for the entire galaxy and wipe out countless lives. We saw Jean Grey get overcome by the Phoenix Force's power, attack her friends, and destroy a world before sacrificing herself to save everyone. Yes, well, not really. Before long, the X-Men comics revealed Jean was actually chilling out in a cocoon at the bottom of Jamaica Bay. That Jean Grey that did all those incredibly horrible things? That Jeannie McBeanie? That wasn't Jean at all. Instead, it was revealed that it was actually the Phoenix Force which had taken on the physical form of Jean Grey. The real Jean never did the horrible things the Phoenix did. On one hand, we got Jean Grey back. On the other hand, the change completely uprooted the Dark Phoenix's sagas, message, and legacy, which ticked off a lot of fans. Next up on our list is, kind of a weird one. Bit of a strange fella. It's also incredibly small in the grand scheme of things. Oh, and it's also 100% unnecessary and just weird and was done purely for shock factor storytelling. Sentry Fallen Sun is a comic that depicts the funeral for the Sentry after he was taken down by Thor during the Siege event. A whole bunch of superheroes are at his funeral. The Fantastic Four, Daredevil, Tony Stark, Cyclops, Rogue, and Emma Frost, Doctor Strange, they are all giving their thoughts and prayers saying nice things about Sentry. Thor even goes and dances with Sentry's mom. It's wholesome. But then we have Rogue. Rogue tries to say her piece. She talks about how she went for a long time without being able to touch somebody, except for the Sentry, who was the only person who could hug her. And then she gets overwhelmed and runs off crying. And then, in a little under the breath moment between Johnny Storm and Cyclops, it's basically implied that Rogue and Sentry had, they did the thing. It's just so random and so unnecessary and really out of place. Speaking of random, unnecessary, out of place, and romance, following the untimely passing of Professor Charles Xavier at the hands of his own golden boy Cyclops, who was possessed by the Phoenix Force during the Avengers vs. X-Men event, Xavier's last will and testament are read out by Jennifer Walters' She-Hulk to a room full of mourning listeners. In Uncanny X-Men number 24, fittingly titled The Last Will and Testament of Charles Xavier, Jen reveals to the room of At Odds X-Men that at some point in Xavier's past, he not just loved, but actually married Raven Darkholme, better known as Mystique. As you can imagine, almost every single person in that room was shocked and confused. He then went on to tell them about the most powerful mutant any of them had ever seen, and they had to go deal with that. But Professor X married Mystique, so I guess that kind of makes him Nightcrawler's stepdaddy. which is weird. Speaking of which, it's common knowledge to most readers by now that Nightcrawler is the son of Mystique, something that was revealed and confirmed ages ago in 1994. To cut the story short, Mystique was posing as a German woman and became the wife of a very wealthy and regular human man. After giving birth to a very much not normal human mutant child in the form of Nightcrawler and exposing herself as a mutant during labor, she ran away, abandoning baby Nightcrawler. It was later revealed that Kurt's odd appearance wasn't just due to Mystique being another blue mutant, but was actually due to his real father, which by the way was not the human man. Kurt's biological father is actually Azazel, a member of an interdimensional group of ancient demon-like mutants. To maintain his presence on Earth, Azazel basically makes babies every few years. The children are then used as anchors to keep him aligned to our world. This retcon changed Nightcrawler's origin, sure, but it also gave him a ton of siblings, and it also, inexplicably, changed another X-Men as well, Angel. Angel was now a descendant of an equally ancient offshoot of mutants, but instead of having a demonic appearance, they possessed angelic qualities. Oh, so cool. I hate it. Now personally, I am a fan of this next retcon. So after having the adamantium forcibly ripped out of his body by Magneto in X-Men number 25 Volume 2, Wolverine came to learn that his claws were actually made of bone and are a part of his mutation. This revelation came alongside a whole bunch of other things that the traumatic events had on Logan, but funnily enough, this small little fact of his claws being natural was large enough to blow a hole in several Wolverine stories where he specifically talks about not having claws before getting involved with the Weapon X program. In the past, there were actual panels of Wolverine having his adamantium bonded to his skeleton, and it was heavily implied that the claws were implanted alongside all of it. Now of course, Marvel waved this off with the unreliability of his fragmented memories, but funnily enough, it started a whole thing of uncovering Wolverine's past, which led to him being well over 100 years old, having his real name be James Howlett, not Logan, as he thought it was. So it's not entirely negative, but there's no negatives here. From the day of Lucas Bishop's debut in Uncanny X-Men, he was a good guy. Righteous, self-sacrificing, a literal man of the law from the future. He had a huge degree of integrity, and unlike a lot of other characters, he never seemed to waver on that, which is why, when we saw his sudden and drastic change to brutal villainy, most fans were left flabbergasted even if the explanation was clear and out in the open. Now we knew that Bishop came to the main 616 timeline to stop what was commonly referred to as the X-Traitor. At first he thought it was Gambit, then after Onslaught he thought maybe it was Xavier, but then 10 years later, after having never mentioned her or anything like her before, Bishop decided once and for all that it was actually the first baby born since M-Day, Hope Summers. The child would soon be adopted by Cable, and Bishop set out to send the sweet fresh mutant back to the Shadow Realm. Bishop nearly took the life of Professor X, someone he committed to protecting. Oh, and he slaughtered the entire population of a future version of Earth just to cut down on the places that Cable and Hope could run to. The Messiah story arc was honestly loved by so many people. It's kind of super awesome. But the heel turn in Bishop's personality was then explained away as being him being possessed by a demon bear. What does that even mean? Now last up for the day, after Cassandra Nova, the insanely powerful twin of Professor X, leveled the mutant city of Genosha, Magneto was nowhere to be found, and thus he was presumed to have bit the dust in the attack. But then the new X-Men member, Zorn, revealed that he was actually Magneto in disguise. Whoa, crazy, cool. What's not so cool was that upon the reveal, Magneto destroyed the X-Mansion and attacked New York City, taking a lot of people's lives and making a lot more people his prisoners. Now, obviously, the X-Men eventually triumph, but not before Magneto fatally injures Jean Grey with a, quote, planetary scale stroke. It's stupid, but for that crime, Wolverine relieved Magneto of his head. So that's Magneto gone for good, right? Nuh-uh-uh. Once the writer of the story, Grant Morrison, finished his run, Marvel brought both Magneto and Zorn back, and even revealed that there was actually two two Zorns. The Zorn that the X-Men had come to know wasn't actually Magneto at all, but an imposter, and the new Zorn was that one's brother. So, Magneto was cleared of wiping out hundreds of thousands of people this one time, and that made it okay for the supervillain to become one of the X-Men.
Gambit doesn't often get as much love in the comics when it comes to what he is capable of, but he is actually capable of quite a lot. A lot of people don't think of him as being super powerful, and the reality is, it's because he's actually actively holding back pretty much all of the time. Gambit actually reached out to Mr. Sinister about helping him nerf his powers because then they would be more easy to control, which is something that he was worried about, so he has been holding back for a long time in the comics because of this. Gambit also learns of his alternate self, New Sun, and is basically warned of what would happen if he tapped into his full potential. Spoiler, it ain't good. New Sun hails from a world that was destroyed because of how powerful he was. Vulcan is pretty insanely powerful and in a dangerous way too, because he's so capable of evil due to being manipulated during his time in the Vault. In fact, in Empire we saw what was probably only a small fraction of what his darker side was capable of when he ran into the Kotati while out for a walk on the blue area of the moon, where the Summers house was located during the Krakoan era. He attempted to deal with the situation peacefully when he approached them, initially anyways, showing mercy, but when provoked, his darker side was unleashed, causing him to kill everyone save one member of the Kotati, who was basically left traumatized, uncontrollably uttering the word Krakoa on repeat. Holding back is a huge part of who this character is, or who this character has been for a long time. We're talking about Gentle. Now, I love Gentle, and I think that he deserves more love in the comics, which is why I am super happy to be featuring him on this list, although at least he's gotten more to do recently with him appearing alongside T'Challa in the Black Panther series, where he was revealed to actually have been working undercover for a long time with the King and for Wakanda. That's a whole thing. I'm not super well versed in it because I need to go and read that Black Panther series, but honestly, a lot of it seemed pretty cool. Gentle has vibranium tattoos which actively help him to control and at times restrain his super strength and super muscly powers. Also, they look really cool. It's unknown just how powerful Gentle could be, though it is believed the level of strength he is capable of could be in fact limitless, and that he could even hold his own against the likes of the Hulk. Gentle initially held back on using his powers because of trauma, which manifested in the form of a fear of his powers and physical pain whenever he used them. However, it was later revealed by Jean Grey that this weakness was actually a psychological barrier in his mind as opposed to being legitimately tied to his mutant powers themselves. She helped him to emotionally heal and recover from this, removing this weakness from him. Still though, he probably holds back a lot because he is really strong. I mean, what can I say about Hope that you don't already know? Hope Summers is definitely one of the most powerful mutants around in the comics, and the X-Men were fortunate for a time to have her on the roster. Hope's powers allow her to take at peak mastery the powers of any mutants that are within her vicinity. She is only limited by a certain range in terms of her ability to adopt one's powers. She doesn't drain the powers of her target, and she is instantly able to master any ability, any power set that she takes on. Honestly, it's pretty wild. She's also literally mutant Jesus, being the baby everyone fought over in X-Men Second Coming. Hope isn't a Summers by birth, but she was adopted by the biological son of Scott Summers and Madeline Pryor, and the adopted son of Jean Grey, Cable, aka Nathan Summers. Storm is a literal goddess in the comics. There are many times when, like her friend Rogue, if she simply chose to just not hold back, she could just do some serious damage to her enemies. However, Storm is a hero, and as such often prefers to maintain a sense of restraint and spare her enemies from a fatal demise when she can. Storm not only holds back when it comes to her powers, but also when it comes to her fighting prowess as well, as she is also an extremely skilled physical combatant. Rogue has since come much more into her own in the comics, with her gaining more control over her powers, meaning that she is no longer as burdened with having to worry about hurting those she cares for by accident. Rogue's powers allow her to absorb the powers and even memories of others through touch. She can take on multiple powers at once, but the setback is that her touch can also drain the life force of energy of whoever she makes contact with. Now, it turns out that the loss of control of her powers came from a very real place for most of us, her own fear of being close to people, of intimacy, and of acceptance. For Rogue, she just had to make the choice to just accept herself and not be afraid, and it was through that basically therapeutic work that she was then able to take control of her abilities fully. So if you've seen her making out with Gambit a ton in the comics, that's why, and that's how she's able to do that. And if you see Rogue coming your way, you do not have to be afraid, unless of course you are one of the baddies, and then you should be very afraid. Yep. Rachel Summers is definitely one of the most powerful mutants and X-Men members that we have. She is the alternate reality daughter of Cyclops and Jean Grey, who of course are known to make powerful children together across the multiverse. Hence also why Sinister is so obsessed with the two of them getting together. Rachel is one of the chosen hosts of the Phoenix Force, and even without the Phoenix is extremely powerful, being an immensely powerful telepath, telekinetic, and chronokinetic. She can read time, skip through it, travel to alternate timelines and dimensions, and even manipulate time. Yeah, she's pretty powerful. She also happens to be immune to timeline alterations as well, and is unique in that she is the only version of herself throughout the entire multiverse. Even another Rachel Summers is not technically considered an alternate of Rachel as such. Even if she had the same name and kind of the same vibe, Rachel is 100% her own. She has no other versions of herself, which also makes her uniquely well suited to time travel. Less paradoxes, you know what I mean? Did you know that Spider-Man was an X-Man? Yeah, he was. Even though he's not really a mutant, but a mutate. Kinda makes you feel bad for Deadpool, doesn't it? Who always wants to join in on all this mutant fun and games, but is so often shafted by them because, well, he's Wade, and he's pretty annoying. Sorry, Wade. Spider-Man ended up joining the X-Men in the wake of Wolverine's death, as Storm had found papers regarding an idea to have him join the team and teach his own special class of mutants. As such, he joins the X-Men in Spider-Man and the X-Men issue number 1. There are multiple times in the comics where Peter has actively been shown to pull his punches for fear of doing some serious damage to his foes. If Spider-Man weren't holding back, he could likely kill some of the people he comes up against with one well-placed punch, and there are many stories that have kind of talked about that. Well, we never really get to know Miranda's codename, or even, honestly, her full name. We just know her as Miranda. She was given her very own mutant class. That is how great her powers are considered to be. Beast had to create a whole new classification of power levels just for her. She only appears in the Worst X-Men Ever limited series, which by the way is a really great read that I would recommend you check out if you haven't already. Miranda here is shown to have reality warping powers, but ones that don't adversely affect space, time, or the multiverse. Anything in her reality or the fabric of the continuum, which is pretty insane, because every other reality warper has some of that to some extent, pretty much. Beast decided to give her the new classification, which would sit above Omega with the name of Omicron, just because he thought that was one of the most ominous sounding letters of the Greek alphabet. I think my favorite thing is that although in this universe Miranda was beyond Omega level and could have fixed the world in a snap, she understood why the balance of everything had to be maintained, and so instead she chose to hold back instead of just simply using her powers to completely change the world for better, or, you know, perhaps accidentally for worse, as so many reality warpers sometimes do. Nate Grey has to be one of the most powerful mutants that I know, and is likely also one of the most powerful mutants to have ever existed. He is believed to be the perfect genetic offspring of Jean Grey and Scott Summers. Yeah, another Jean Grey Scott baby. Hailing from the Age of Apocalypse reality where he was genetically engineered by his world Sinister. You know Sinister, in any universe he's pretty much obsessed with creating the perfect mutant, which in this case is believed to be X-Man. Nate would be raised not by his genetic parents but by the AOA version of Forge, who is basically his adoptive father here. Nate has both fought on the side of his own reality's X-Men, but while he's also capable of traveling to other dimensions and realities in addition to manipulating time as well, Nate has also fought alongside the X-Men of Earth 616 too, even joining the team in 1999 in Astonishing X-Men issue number 1.